I work for the Home Office in the Knowledge and Information Management unit, and I specifically work on knowledge management and different tools and techniques that we can use to encourage knowledge sharing across the Home Office. So I thought we could start off by telling you one of the stories, or at least part of one of the stories that we use in the Home Office to try and help us to share knowledge. So I'll tell you a story about this man. He's called Daryl Sinister, and he's from Kidderminster in the West Midlands. Now, when Daryl was about 30, in the year 2000, he went on holiday to Porthcawl in South Wales with some family friends. On the holiday, there was a row, a bit of a falling out kind of thing that happens on group holidays sometimes. Daryl was really upset, and he decided that he was gonna walk home. Now, Daryl has learning difficulties, so it's possible that he didn't realise just how far Porthcawl was from Kidderminster. And understandably, on that journey, he got tired, he needed to stop, so he rested for a while in a bush shelter. After a while, two men pulled up and they started to chat to Daryl, just asking him where he was going, what he was up to. And one of them, a man called David Doran, he asked Daryl if he wanted to come and work on his farm for a couple of days. Now, Daryl was clearly at a bit of a loose end. He thought that didn't sound like a bad idea, so he agreed. He got into the car with David Doran to go and work for him for a couple of days. Daryl worked on that farm for the next 13 years. I say worked, but he was never paid. He never had a holiday. He was forced to work up to 16 hours a day. He was terrorized constantly by David Doran. He had a rat-infested barn to sleep in, and he simply had a horse trough available to wash in. Daryl was eventually found by his family in February 2013. His mother, in particular, never gave up looking for him. And David Doran was taken to court, as you'd hope he would be. Now, the story of Daryl and what had happened to him, it created a lot of media attention. Not just because of the conditions that Daryl had been forced to work in and the way this vulnerable man had been exploited. There was also outcry, a huge amount of attention on the sentence that David Doran received. He was given just 4.5 years. It came to be described as the case that lifted the lid on modern slavery in the UK. Okay, so that's just the first part of one of the stories that we tell in the Home Office. That one is all about the modern slavery bill, the different highs and lows and twists and turns that we went through in bringing that bringing the Modern Slavery Act into play. It looks a lot at the successes, the areas we could have improved on, and the lessons that we really learned throughout the process of that being created. And lessons are a key part, really, of why we use stories in the Home Office. So I was going to tell you a little bit more about why we use them, and also some of the other tools and techniques that we use to try and help us to learn lessons and share knowledge. But I thought we could just start with a really, really simple exercise. Just like you to pop in the chat pane an advantage or disadvantage of traveling on public transport. You can do a couple, you can do both, but you can pop something in the chat pane, just advantage or disadvantage of public transport. Some good points made there. What I'm now going to do, just very, very quickly, and there's no feeding back afterwards or anything like that, I'm just going to pop you into a breakout room. You'll have 1 minute each, so really, really quick. I'd just like you to tell each other, so there'll be two of you in a breakout room, tell each other about a memorable journey that you took on public transport. It can be a good journey, a bad journey, just something memorable. And if you're able to, pop your camera on so that you can see each other as you're doing this. But like I say, there's nothing fed back afterwards. It's just a really, really quick exercise. So I'll just do those breakout rooms quickly now. the kind of thing that you usually, when somebody's telling you a story, they're generally far more animated. So we've run this exercise quite a few times, and we sometimes run it in a room of, you know, 100 and odd people. And the difference when you see 100 odd people in pairs telling a story compared to, you know, giving each other a list is really quite stark. You know, there's so much more energy. People are much more animated as they're talking. You're picking up an awful lot more when that person is telling you a story compared to when they're simply giving you a list of things. When we compare that energy, when we compare the fact that there's more of a connection being made as well, we compare that to the list. It makes us think about the approach that we use to learn lessons. So we know that learning lessons is something that's incredibly important as people, as organizations. It's an area where we know it helps us to grow, whether it's good lessons or bad lessons. But so often we try to do this using essentially a list. It could be just a report, it could be a spreadsheet at the end of some event or something that's happened. You get a spreadsheet, a lessons learned spreadsheet that comes around and says, pop the lesson on here, and we end up with a list. And that's really the driving force behind what we've been trying to use stories for, is to find a different way to learn lessons in the Home Office. I'm just going to pop my slides back on, because there's a couple of points on this one I'd just like to show you. So yeah, so stories. This slide has a few little points on it that explain why we use them. So obviously, using stories to put structure and pass information on, it is not a new thing. It's been around for a very, very long time. But one of the reasons that we find stories are more effective for doing this is that they're more memorable. So we know that when we look back at lessons that have been learned from something, or you know, the lessons that we want to share, the standard approach is for us certainly was always a report. We'll get somebody to do an audit or a report, and they'll be able to tell us what those things are. But we know that when we hear a fact or a figure, for example, within the context of a story, we're around 20 times more likely to remember it. So it's a much more memorable thing. If I ask you in a few weeks' time what was in the chat pane of those advantages and disadvantages of public transport, it's quite likely you wouldn't remember what was there. But I've asked you about the story, if you were able to, of course, if the stories that you heard in the breakout room, or the story that you told, you're much more likely to remember that. And as well as what was said, you'll remember a lot of extra things as well. You'll remember how you felt when you heard that story, what it reminded you of, how the person seemed when they were telling the story. But almost more importantly than it just being more memorable, because of what's happening in our brain when we hear a story, as is pointed out on a couple of parts of this slide, because of the emotional connection that's taking place, things like mirroring and neural coupling, we're empathizing with a person, we're much more likely to do things differently. We're much more likely to change our behaviour, which is so often where we fall down when it comes to lessons learned. We identify them, but nothing changes. And that was essentially the driver for us using this technique in the Home Office. So we do most of our storytelling under the Learning from Experience programme. That's the banner that we've given it, and that was set up really to help us to use stories to try and learn lessons more effectively. It was an initiative that was set up around about 8 to 9 years ago. It was set up by our permanent secretary at the time, Mark Sedwell. He'd seen it used very effectively in previous roles that he'd had in the Foreign Office and in different countries, and he thought it was something that we could use to help deal with this problem that he'd very quickly identified as being something that was holding us back, our inability to learn lessons, whether that's good things that we've done or bad things. And that was obviously something that he identified, but is of course common to lots of big organisations. We make the same mistakes over again. We don't make the most of the successes that we've had. The problem wasn't necessarily that we hadn't identified lessons. We were doing reviews, we were looking at projects and programs, we were assessing them and looking at what we could learn from them, but we weren't actually putting them into practice. So this program was set up to try and help with that, to see how storytelling could help them be, those reviews be conducted and delivered in a way that had more impact. Now, the stories that we tell, and it's always, the Learning from Experience program has always dealt with, are organizational stories. So they're not personal ones. A lot of sort of storytelling training and things that you see is around a sort of leadership skill, using stories to help people understand your perspective or your values. We're using it differently in the Home Office. So we're telling stories from an organizational perspective. So it's what we learned as an organization. It's been very clear from the beginning of this work that it's a no blame exercise. So it's not an audit to go back and point the finger and say, well, it all went wrong because of this person. It was looking at the organization's experience, and it was done in this no blame way to really encourage people to be honest and to share. So straight away we could see a difference in how using the storytelling approach affected initially just the capture of the lessons. So they were done in an interview style. That's how they were conducted. So it was very conversational. It was quite different than the approaches we'd done previously, where it had just been maybe a big spreadsheet that we sent around to people. And the advantage of having those conversations was it allowed us to tap into the tacit knowledge that people had, the knowledge that only exists in their head, that we can only really share in conversations. So those interviews, those conversations, people were then able to share experiences, little anecdotes, little insights into the culture of the organisation or the team at the time, things that just weren't being captured with the previous approach that we'd used. You essentially had a much richer picture of what took place. And that was partly because people had a much broader canvas, if you like, to tell us what they knew and to share what they knew. But it was also because they were being given time to reflect on what had happened, to sort of distill the experience down into those insights that they could share with us. And when you read through some of the notes from the interviews, actually from some of the early ones, it's really interesting. You can almost see that process taking place. But we also took quite a different approach to how these were delivered. As I say, the standard approach we'd used up to that point was, lessons learned would be delivered in a report. These were presented. They were presented as a story, live to an audience of stakeholders. Over the years, the approach has changed a little bit and it's improved. The way that we put the stories together, if you like, it has been changed to try and make that more impactful. But we do still try and deliver them live, whether that's virtually now or more historically we did that in person at different staff events like away days and things like that. We would tell a story, but then we'd always facilitate a discussion. And that was a key part in helping people pick out the lessons to see how it could apply to them, how it could change the way they work. So that facilitated discussion is something that we make sure always happens, so that we can make sure we get the most of it, and it's not just an interesting thing to listen to. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more now about how we put these stories together. Hopefully can be useful for you. So one of the techniques we use is for putting some structure together is Freytag's pyramid. So this is just a really simple, helpful tool for taking all of your findings, all of the events that you've been gathering information on and insights, and putting it into a structure that helps it look like a story rather than a report, if you like. Now, it's called lots of different things, this Freytag's pyramid. Like you can see on the slide, it's a really simple thing. I think even in schools from quite a young age, they call them story mountains, and they're encouraging children to put their stories into this kind of arc. Just helps try and prevent us from falling into the trap of presenting everything chronologically, and it helps you to categorize the different stages or events that you're looking at in a way that's going to lend themselves to being presented as a story. So just on what some of those stages represent. So you have the exposition, where you're introducing characters, you're setting the scene, you're providing a bit of background that your audience is going to need. You then take that into your rising action. This is where things start to take place that build up. Maybe there's some tension. This takes up quite a lot of the story often. And it's building towards that turning point, the big moment where things change, where nothing remains the same. It can be a positive thing, it can be a bad thing, but you recognise this from probably most of the stories and films that you've read and seen, and there will usually be this turning point that you've been building up to. We then call the next section falling action, where it's a series of events. This usually happens quite quickly. And it's building up towards the resolution or the conclusion. That's where you can really draw out what the lessons are from the story, where you can ultimately take people through to the conclusion of what happened. So we find that a really useful way of structuring the story. One of the things that we do, because we're quite a small team in the Home Office, and there's lots of stories, so we tend to just focus on the sort of cross-organisational stories. We'll put those together, but we'll give people tools like this, just a very simple template to encourage them to use this technique for themselves, to reflect on maybe some of the things that have happened that they want to learn from and they want to share with others. So we provide quite a lot of resource to help people put their own experiences into stories and to share them that way. So we also give them guidance on how to conduct those interviews with tips and techniques and things to make sure they get the most from that too. So as well as the structure, we always try and make sure we include these characteristics. This goes back to that slide we had earlier on with the picture of what's going on in our brains. So having these characteristics really helps to make sure that you make the most of those opportunities, that we can create those extra connections. So just I won't read through all of those, but stickiness is a really important one. The way that the story is written and presented, try and make a nice sort of simple sentences, put in some mental images. They tend to be things that make it stick. You can bring it straight back to mind as soon as you maybe hear a couple of words that brings that mental image back. Probably the other one we get asked a lot about is the authentic one. Hopefully that would go without saying, that the story had to be true when you're looking at lessons learned. That's not to say it has to be a full recounting of every single thing that happened in this event. Like we say, it's not an audit. You can focus more on certain aspects of the story that help to make the lessons land in the most impactful way. But it must be true. I've lost count of the number of times we've told a story and there's been somebody in the audience who said, "Oh yeah, I was there. I worked on that." The loss of credibility from giving into the temptation to just change something to make it seem a bit more dramatic would seriously discount its effectiveness as a tool. And that last one there, we've got the bottom, purpose. So we tell a lot of the stories. The tendency when somebody requests a story is that if they're frontline, they'll say, "Oh, can we have a frontline story?" Or if they're in policy, they want to hear a policy one. We try and switch it up sometimes as well, so that basically you're getting to look at things from other people's perspectives, and you're able to talk about the lessons that they would have learned, and it helps sort of create those links across the organisation and helps people to look at things in that more system-wide way. There's some of the characteristics that we try and include. So just a few interesting quotes there on storytelling. Like I say, we are far from being new in using this. Lots of organisations do use it. We don't encounter many that use it from that organisational perspective. It does tend to be personal stories that people have gone through, but we find it a really effective way of helping people to share knowledge. That's the team that I work in. That's essentially what we're putting all of this under, is knowledge sharing. How do we help people share the great tacit knowledge that they've got in their brains, as well as the explicit knowledge? And I know that whole thing around what is the difference between data, information, and knowledge is something that there's not always a complete agreement on. But the approach we take is that knowledge, it is different than data and information, and that there are essentially two types of knowledge. You've got your explicit knowledge, so the stuff that can be written down, that can be shared by giving people access or taking away access. And then there's that extremely valuable tacit knowledge that's based on people's experience, their values and their learning. And the only really effective way of sharing that knowledge is through conversations. So it's through connecting people and helping them to have those conversations. So it's just a quick overview of how we use storytelling and a catastrophized session. I don't know if anybody's got any questions on any of that. We'll just